You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. My guest this week is best-selling, award-winning author Jennifer Cody Epstein. Jennifer's latest novel, The Madwomen of Paris, is a work of historical fiction set in Paris's 19th century Salpêtrière, a notorious women's asylum. Here, women are treated for hysteria by world-famous Doctor Jean-Martine Charcot, often publicly, on stage, and under hypnosis. When Josephine is admitted to the hospital in a fit of rage and amnesia, she is placed under the care of Laure, a former resident-turned-attendant. They quickly form a strong connection that forces them to separate truth from fiction in all facets of their lives, which may include murder. Please allow me to introduce Jennifer Cody Epstein, author of The Madwomen of Paris. Hello, Jennifer. It's so nice to meet you. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I am a Brooklyn-based, for now, novelist. I have written 4 novels, most recently The Madwomen of Paris, which is coming out in about a week with Ballantine Press. I turned to fiction after being a journalist for about 10 years and living overseas in a variety of places, mostly in Asia. And I also have a degree in international relations. So I've got a pretty deep interest in sort of history and sort of political currents, which I think is reflected in the fact that over the last 4 books, I've actually chosen pretty international and politicized topics. So my historical fiction tends to be somewhat heavy, focusing on kind of the darker and more complex moments in different parts of world history that I find really interesting. And Madwomen of Paris is no exception. So.
Do you have a connection to Paris or to France yourself?
Only that I have a number of close friends there. And so I visit a fair amount. And, my first novel was actually a fictionalized sort of reimagining of the life of a Chinese painter named Pan Yulong. But she ended up in Paris presenting at the Salon and teaching and studying at the Beaux-Arts. And so my first sort of fictional encounter with Paris was really with that book. So I came to Paris and did some research for it and hung out with some of my friends and generally just fell even more in love with the city than I already was. So
sounds perfect. So can you tell us a little bit about The Madwomen of Paris and what it's about?
Sure. The Madwomen of Paris is a novel set at the Salpêtrière asylum in Paris, obviously. It's still a teaching hospital now, but at the period that I was writing, which was sort of the mid-1800s to late 1800s, it was Europe's largest women's asylum, possibly the world's largest women's asylum, but certainly Europe's. And it was home to thousands of women who suffered from different kinds of disorders, everything from syphilis to lunacy to hysteria, which in sort of the 1860s, 1870s was considered an epidemic disease in France, as it was much else in many other places in the world. And I kind of stumbled on the topic because I was online trying to figure out my next novel and got sort of hooked into this whole Victorian death photograph sort of search, which was very fascinating. And I don't really know what I was thinking in terms of trying to turn that into a book, because it would have been probably even darker and grimmer as a topic. But I did then stumble across this image of a young woman in this extraordinary sort of contorted position, looking defiantly at the camera. It was clearly from the same period, but it was clearly not of somebody who was dead. And then that just sent me off on this whole rabbit hole hunt for who she was, what her story was, why was she positioned like that? Who was taking this photograph? And that landed me squarely in the Salpêtrière's Hysteria Award, which, she was one of the hysterics, a woman named Augustine Gliese. And I'm sure I'm not pronouncing all of these things correctly, but that was her name. And she was one of Jean-Martine Charcot's sort of favorite hysterics at the Salpêtrière at a time when he was very single-mindedly focusing on hysteria, as he had diseases like Parkinson's and ALS, which he quite brilliantly sort of demystified and explained for people. And he was trying to demystify hysteria in the same way, because it was a malady that had really confounded medical experts since the days of ancient Egypt. Actually, there's records of people sort of talking about it then. And his approach was to treat the Hysteria Award at the Salpêtrière, where he was a director, as his sort of personal laboratory. And he would pick out interesting cases, young women, usually poor women, and study them and study their just spectacular range of symptoms that these women were exhibiting. And he used hypnosis in an attempt to kind of impose a kind of order on what was otherwise a very chaotic expression of the disease. And he then would integrate some of these women into his very popular public lectures on Fridays and put them on a brand new state-of-the-art stage that was built at the Salpêtrière for this reason, in large part, and draw hundreds of spectators, including many just ordinary people outside of the medical and scientific communities who, not surprisingly, found this whole sort of idea of young women being hypnotized, oftentimes in their under things, and then contorting and doing all kinds of remarkable things under the influence of hypnosis. They found that very, very interesting. So once I discovered this, I was just like, wow, this is wild. And I decided that I really wanted to see if I could set a novel in that particular part of the history. I think that the Salpêtrière itself and hysteria has been examined in a couple other novels that I'm aware of, but nobody had really honed in on Charcot himself and on this very bizarre sort of hyper focus on, hysteria in a kind of clinical and theatrical sense. So I really wanted to understand that better. So I began researching and then just began writing. And, after many sort of difficult incarnations, the Madwomen of Paris was born.
You said so many extremely interesting things there. I don't want to dig into a lot of it. But first, you said that this book, the idea for it started with a photograph?
Yes.
Is that how all of your books have started, or is that just a one-off?
I actually, when I look back on it, most of them have been very influenced by images. I don't think they all were started with it. The last one that I did, Wonderland, actually started with a memoir by a woman named Melita Moshman that was drawn to my attention. But the books before that were very influenced by images. Painter from Shanghai started with an image at the Guggenheim Museum that was a self-portrait of Pan Yulong's that I just was really struck by. And when I looked at the label that had been attached to it, which gave a very brief version of her life story, I was absolutely riveted because I just never heard anything like it and couldn't believe that most people I knew, even in the art world, didn't seem to know much about her. So that started me off on that journey. And then Gods of Heavenly Punishment is about the firebombing of Tokyo. And I think that was really inspired in large part by period photographs, both of the destruction that the firebombing of Tokyo wrought, but also very fascinating images that sort of juxtaposed modern ideas of Japan into sort of this very gloomy post-war imagery. And so I referred to those a lot as well as I was working on that book.
Do you tend to have images up around you while you're working?
I definitely did with Painter from Shanghai. I just sort of taped them all over my working area at home. And yeah, with this one as well, I had images of some of these hysterics. I had a big period map of Paris pinned up on my cubicle because, trying to sort of navigate where people were at different times was complicated. And obviously you can only do it with a map sort of from that time. So one of the resources I tend to rely on a lot with my works are period guidebooks. So I had a Baedekers from 1896 that I bought online.
Wow.
It's a big fold out map. And I used that map as I was trying to envision what Paris looked like and how people got around.
That's so cool.
It is. Yeah. No, there's all kinds of really interesting resources out there. So.
Well, speaking of which, so can you talk a little bit about the research that you did in addition to images and maps?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I did do a lot of, I looked at a lot of the imagery. When I came to Paris, I had a tour of the Salpêtrière and visited the Charcot library, which was then being moved. So it was a little bit disorganized, but it was an amazing opportunity to kind of actually be in among Charcot's actual books and his things, and to talk to the archivist about some of the records and transcriptions that I'd read about. And then there were also, just numerous sources on this one, which was great, of, what hysteria was, what Charcot and his protégés, including Sigmund Freud and Georges Gilles de la Tourette and Pierre Janet. I mean, just everybody who was sort of anybody in that world seemed to work with Charcot, which was another thing that really, really drew me to it. So lots of scholarly papers and books and biographies. There was far less on the women of the Salpêtrière themselves, but there was a very helpful source called Medical Muses, actually, by Astrid Hustvedt. And that was published back in the 1980s. But she was somebody who went in and really just focused on the transcriptions that talked about, who these women were and how the medical community dealt with them. Some of these wild experiments and sort of exercises that the doctors were performing on them after they hypnotized them were outlined in a lot of detail there in English, which was super helpful because I don't actually read French. And then I had also researchers in Paris, I think 3 or 4 people who were helping me as well, who did speak and read French. So they also dug in and kind of followed up on stuff. And yeah, I have a, whole Excel spreadsheet of all the different sources and websites that I went to. It was a lot. I probably dove too deeply into the research in some ways because it took a while for me to begin to pull the fictional narrative out of it and to really sort of find my way into the kind of book that I wanted to write that wasn't simply reflective of the historical data that I was mining.
Yeah, that definitely comes through. The hypnosis in the book is fascinating. I mean, I think hypnosis in general is pretty fascinating.
Absolutely, yeah.
But the stories that you tell and the things that we get to sort of watch are really interesting. And then knowing that they were on stage, these were like these theatrical sort of shows, was also shocking, but also not so shocking.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I think it was it's an ongoing theme in medicine. I think there's a tendency to either overlook women's issues or fetishize them, and I think that you're sort of seeing a combination of both in Charcot's lectures, that, he had his own version of what he thought these women were suffering from, and he would sort of impose that on, their symptoms, the things that they were trying to express, and kind of control the narrative in that way. And I think that's done, obviously not on stage in the same way, but in many other ways in modern day medicine still.
Yeah, for sure. And just even not listening to women when they try to tell you that there's something wrong.
Right.
Minimizing that too.
And thinking it's an emotional issue.
Right. Exactly. Right. Exactly.
It's all your emotions. So
just change your mindset. You'll be fine.
Exactly. Relax, take some tranquilizers.
And so why was Charcot so interesting at this time? Was hypnosis a new thing, or was he just sort of a master of it?
Hypnosis was not a new thing, but it was not something that had been used with any kind of credibility as a research tool. It was really kind of more for entertainment. There were all kinds of hypnosis shows that were being put on all over Europe and America. People were really interested in it, but it was sort of seen as a little bit shady and, mainly just entertainment. And I think what he did that was interesting was he kind of reclaimed it. It had been sort of proposed as a scientific sort of tool, I think in the 18th century, after Mesmer, who was the person who discovered it, sort of was arguing for it in those contexts, and which is why we have the term mesmerism. His name is kind of legendarily now associated with it. But Charcot really was, I think, the first person in a couple hundred years to decide to use it in a real medical sense. And I think he saw that as a real victory. Of course, there were others in the field who didn't see it as defensible in the same way. And so I think that there was a lot of debate, even as he was gaining more and more fame for these presentations, about whether he was, first of all, exploiting these women, whether it was actually a valid tool. Was he really pulling these organic symptoms out of them, as he claimed, or was he actually suggesting them to these women so that they would then, and then of course the women themselves, were all poor and incredibly vulnerable. and had a lot to gain by presenting their symptoms and their illness in the way that Charcot felt it should be presented. So, there were all kinds of fraught factors going into these presentations and into his supposedly sort of scientific research using hypnosis. But that was also part of what drew me to the story. It was just so fascinating that this was part of their official approach to the disease.
Curious about what's going on in Paris right now? My second podcast, Don't Miss This, takes you beyond the typical and the obvious with a weekly roundup of the best of what's happening in Paris each week. Never wonder what you're missing out on again. Listen now to Don't Miss This on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. But Laure, so our main character, cannot be hypnotized. The two women that she's sort of charged with at different times of the book, they can be. They're actually pretty highly susceptible or suggestible, but she cannot be hypnotized. Did you ever toy with the idea of making her hypnotizable?
I think in the very beginning, but I realized I wanted to do a few things with Laure. I wanted her to be a clear-headed voice, of kind of reason within the story and at least somewhat dependable. And I felt that if she was somebody who could be sort of manipulated in that way, she would sort of lose some of that credibility. I also, she ends up being, she's someone who cures herself effectively. And I wanted to kind of make that equation sort of apparent, that the women that were being hypnotized over and over and over again were not getting better. In fact, they were generally getting worse, not surprisingly. But, Laure, she started out as Fleur. That was one of the changes. Everybody had several names throughout this whole process. But Laure, was somebody who, she journals a lot. She's very self-reflective. And the fact that she ends up kind of working her way through her issues on her own was important to me from a sort of empowerment perspective as well as a kind of psychological perspective.
She does seem to be quite grounded, even amidst all of this madness, if you will.
Yeah. That was important, I think. It would have been much harder to have her tell that story if she wasn't.
But there are times in the book where you play with our perception of reality, where we think something is happening and then all of a sudden it turns out that it's something else.
Right.
Was this a difficult balance to strike?
Well, sure. I think I knew going into it that it was going to be very difficult because, first of all, the condition of hysteria itself, which is no longer in the DSM, but it was in there until like 1980, I think. But
oh, wow.
Nobody ever really, a lot of these sort of psychological disorders and neurological disorders are very complex. We still haven't figured out what drives a lot of them. And I knew that was going to be tricky. And I also kind of was drawn, by that slipperiness. I sort of saw it as a challenge I really wanted to tackle. I'd never read a book that did that. And I thought, well, maybe I can try to write one. So, that was my rationale for kind of diving in and trying to just follow the different ways that perception would be shaped and changed and challenged, in this very surreal pseudo-medical world.
It's very, very well done.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Even when we're led down these other little paths, it's never jarring when you come back to reality. You never have to be like, wait, what? I don't understand what happened. What's real? What's not? We're always kind of guided through. So I really appreciate that.
Oh, good. Thank you.
And so for all of the history in this book and the personal relationships, which we haven't talked a lot about, but are really intriguing, the book is also quite a feminist book. And I mean that as a compliment.
Yes.
It's never overt. It's never heavy-handed. It's not disingenuous or forced. But the book is really about, like you said, it's about how women aren't listened to and how they're often not given autonomy of their bodies or their life choices. And the men in this book are not necessarily evil, although there are some that are not so good.
Right.
But there are no heroes in the men. There are no men that champion for the women. There's none of that. And I assume that this was a conscious choice. Can you talk a little bit about that?
No, it was definitely a conscious choice. Part of it was that honestly, I have to sort of say one of the things I really struggled with, interestingly, was taking on the men. As a female writer, as a novelist, as someone who's not a medical expert, I was surprisingly daunted by the idea that I was going to be basically manipulating these very famous historical characters, very powerful characters. I mean, Sigmund Freud and Charcot himself especially are just kind of seen as untouchable in large part. And in fact, I literally had a number of friends and acquaintances in France when I went there who were in the medical community. And one of them very clearly just said to me, he's a psychiatrist himself, and he was like, I just don't think you should do this. He really was like, kind of a hands-off Charcot, He didn't think it was going to go over well. And it, we'll see, it probably won't. But at the same time, like the deeper I delved into the material and the research, the more I realized, there were no heroes among the men. There were some that were, they were well-intentioned. And, Charcot was somebody who clearly took steps to kind of humanize the asylum, or the concept of an asylum. And he sort of picked up after, where Philippe Pinel left off, which was sort of liberating the madwomen and getting rid of the chains and the guard dogs and the places that had really made the Salpêtrière more of a prison. But it was still incredibly difficult. And these women were still very vulnerable and really manipulated. And the men were really just curious about studying them as specimens, and that became very clear to me. So the more I wrote, the more I realized I just had to take off my own gloves as a novelist and just present these characters the way that they would have been experienced by the center of my book, the central voices of my book, which were these hysterical, quote unquote, women who were basically at their whim. And it definitely didn't start. I don't think I ever thought it was going to be a lighthearted waltz around Belle Epoque Paris, I think some readers sort of looking at it, might go into it thinking it's going to be that, and then they get a very unpleasant surprise when they read it, which is unfortunate, but it's just the way the book is. But I think the fact that I was writing it during, so much was happening in sort of 2019, 2020, when I was really just in the thick of it. Actually 2017 was when I first got stumbled across the image. And, you had the Me Too movement happening. You had, the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. I've had experiences in my own world of, people that I love dearly being the targets of sexual assault and drug-assisted sexual assault. And, there was a rage that really just began to build, because I think I started out thinking, okay, well, this is going to feel safely in the past. And I'm going to feel as I'm writing it that these things are distant from me and that they're, and the amazing thing about historical fiction, at least the way I choose to write it, is that it never is. It's very much Faulkner's famous line about, the past isn't past. It's not dead. It's very much interwoven into and embedded into and in dialogue with the present. And I really felt that as I was working on this. So yeah, it became much more of a feminist scree than I sort of anticipated, because I think it was a reflection of real outrage over some of the things that I was experiencing and witnessing in the world around us as I wrote it.
That makes a lot of sense. And that comes through too. It's very rich and multidimensional. It doesn't start off, to me either, when I'm reading it, doesn't feel like a feminist book. It feels like a historical novel and these people's personal stories. But as the book goes on, it's really not difficult to make the connections between what happens in the book and what is happening in the world we're living in now.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think women's sort of physical and emotional autonomy continues to be sort of under attack in many ways now, more than ever in America, which is, I think, something else I was really struggling with.
Another thing that I noticed is that Laure is described as plain but intelligent. And then we have the two other women. We have Rosalie, who is this beautiful woman who really loves to be the center of attention, and she's comfortable using the power of her sexuality. And then we have Josephine, who's sort of the opposite, also quite beautiful, but not at all comfortable in that way. She would rather fade into the background, not necessarily not be beautiful, but not have that be the focus of her power.
Yes.
And I can't help thinking that there's a commentary in there somewhere about what it means to be beautiful as a woman in this day and age.
Yeah, no, I definitely put a lot of thought into that, because I think it was very clear. Charcot was very justly and rightly admired for his lectures, and they were pretty popular in the medical community. But the minute he started putting these young, attractive, half-dressed women onto his stage, his reputation just burgeoned. It was like everybody was like, oh, Charcot. And yeah, it did make me think a lot about sort of the weight that is given to appearance and, the mixed blessing / curse that comes with being seen as beautiful, particularly in a world like this where it brings much more attention to you. But it also means that many, many more people want to have a claim over who you are and want to use that beauty because it is a tool and a weapon to their own ends. So I did play a lot with that and think a lot about that. I mean, the other thing I was really interested in, which for me had some sort of modern day resonance, particularly given social media and influencer culture, was the fact that vanity was really seen as a hysterical symptom. A lot of hysterics were actually considered ill because they focused so much on their appearance. They were very into the ribbons and the dressing and the gloves and meticulous about the way that they presented themselves. And, this was seen as a symptom of their disease. But, when I really thought about it, I think you can see it, today as well. It ends up being, I think, for many women, one of the few ways that they feel that they can exert any kind of power because so much weight is put on appearance. So it really is kind of capitalizing on an asset that, for I think a lot of women feels like one of the few weapons that they have to navigate the world. So that was an idea that I was really interested in also exploring.
Very, very interesting. I think you're right. I feel like beauty sometimes becomes like a shorthand definition for a person where you can't actually be anything more or other or in addition to.
Right.
So I appreciate you playing with the idea of vanity, meaning that maybe it's just a form of self-expression.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. And I'm someone who's very interested in fashion myself. I mean, I had a fashion literary blog for a while, which was a lot of fun. But I do see it as a language, and I see it as a language that speaks on many different levels. And that was interesting to kind of try to transpose into 19th century, aesthetics and fashion.
Did you know how this book was going to end when you started?
That was one thing I did know. Yeah, I actually had... Or I knew part of it. I mean, part of what was fascinating to me about, and this is a bit of a spoiler, so hopefully it's okay to talk about it. But, Augustine Glaze got increasingly less and less patient with being sort of the star and center of the Charcot show. And she had several escape attempts that were not successful and was punished for them in different ways, put into sort of isolation or the lunacy division or whatever. And she finally did succeed, and she only succeeded because she dressed as a man and was able to escape the asylum that way. And I just loved everything about that storyline. I thought the fact that she sort of appropriates the male persona and uses it to sort of facilitate her own ends was really interesting to me. And as I thought about that, I started thinking, well, what other ways can we sort of explore this theme? And that was, the sort of other part of her escape in my book, sort of integrates and plays on and sort of builds on that idea. But I had much more trouble getting into it than I did getting out of it, which is kind of the opposite of the way a lot of books work. So it was sort of interesting.
Does French culture sometimes leave you scratching your head? Well, you might enjoy listening to our sister podcast, Navigating the French, hosted by journalist Emily Monaco. Each episode focuses on a different word in the French language, and Emily is joined by an expert who will help explore what that word says about French culture. Listen now to Navigating the French on ParisUndergroundRadio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. Well, I think it would be fabulous if we could hear a little bit from the book. Would you mind reading for us?
Sure. I have a section here that I think sort of captures a lot of what was interesting about this whole world to me. This is before we actually meet Josephine, who's one of the two real sort of central heroines. This is a scene where Laure, who is a ward attendant who, as you know, herself had suffered from hysteria, but miraculously recovers from it, and is now working at the Salpêtrière as a ward attendant, has been assigned to watch Rosalie Chardon, who is, in the book, she's actually a character who's largely drawn from Blanche Whitman, who is another very famous hysteric. You can look her up, and she was pretty extraordinary. Very flamboyant, very rebellious in her own way, very powerful, I thought. And she, sort of loves being the center of the stage. She's exquisitely hypnotizable, but she's also someone who's been coveted and approached by men in powerful positions because she has become so famous and has tried to run off with one of them once, a marquis. And so Laure has been assigned to kind of be her keeper and her guardian. And in this scene, she's supposed to be getting her onto the stage for one of Charcot's lessons, and they're waiting in the sort of back shadowy entrance to the stage for their cue to bring Rosalie on. And Charcot is at this moment with another hysteric that he's at the last minute added to the agenda. And Rosalie's not at all happy about this addition. So that's kind of the backstory. And as if that's not enough, she's apparently deaf too, Rosalie scoffed. She was staring balefully out to where Charcot stood in the stage lights, stooping over his lecture's first subject. Clotilde, a way-haired slip of a hysteric whose arms and legs were dotted with cigar-tip-shaped scars, sat slumped in a wooden chair, her head lolling to one side. Mademoiselle, Charcot repeated, lifting his voice slightly, I asked whether you can hear me. Clotilde shifted sleepily. Oui, docteur, she said, and the words emerged thickly, as though it required enormous effort to push them through her slackened lips. Do you know where you are? In the amphitheater, she said drowsily, on the stage. Correct, Charcot affirmed. Do you know what it was that woke you? Why, you did. No, you were awoken by a sudden pain on your arm. Taking her wrist, Charcot held it up, brushing a spot just past her elbow with his thumb. Here, he said decisively. It hurts because I'm holding a candle above it. The candle is dripping hot wax right on this spot. Can you feel it? Clotilde jerked up in her seat. Ah, she cried, yes, take it away. Her voice was shrill enough that I started, as did several others in the audience. The hysteric tried to pull her arm back, but Charcot held her fast. Can you feel the wax? He intoned as calmly as though he were making an observation about the weather. Your skin is very soft in that spot. I'm sure it must be quite painful. It is, Clotilde said. Her eyes were fully open now, unfocused but wide in distress. It is. Why won't you take it away? Charcot didn't seem to hear. Still holding her firmly, he stared down at the spot he'd indicated, his eyes narrowing in concentration. As Clotilde continued to writhe and protest, some audience members gazed around in puzzlement, as though unsure how they were supposed to be responding. My own stomach tightened uncomfortably too, even though I knew Charcot wasn't actually burning her. He was merely highlighting an intriguing symptom of her illness, as he'd done with numerous other illnesses before. His protégés were clearly taking the exercise in the same way. Most seemed more focused on jotting down the great man's words than questioning what it was he was actually doing. And Rosalie, for her part, merely seemed annoyed. So much whining, she muttered, wrinkling her powdered nose. You'd think he was slicing off her whole arm. But I saw their gaze was no longer on Clotilde, but on a spot in the front row of the seating pit. These seats were usually reserved for members of the medical community and other special guests who'd written about hypnosis, hysteria, and even Charcot himself. But the spot that Rosalie was looking at now was occupied, as it had been for the first hour of the director's presentation, by a coarse-faced man in livery of pale blue and mustard yellow, who was energetically blowing his nose, looking distinctly out of place amid the doctors, interns, and assorted medical students with their cigars, aprons, and battered evening hats. I didn't recognize him. Do you know who that man is? I murmured. In the blue and yellow uniform? Why would I? She retorted, but she avoided my eyes as she said it, and my inner alarm grew louder. Please, Clotilde's tone was now tearful, like that of a child who's been betrayed by a parent. Why are you hurting me like this? Why do men always hurt me? Sometimes the treatment is more painful than the ailment, Charcot said briskly, his dark eyes still fixed on her skin. But trust me, you'll feel better soon enough. He seemed to be waiting for something, and though I had no idea what it was, I found myself holding my breath. And then he grunted, his eyes brightening. Et voilà, he proclaimed. Lifting Clotilde's arm like a trophy, he turned back to his audience. As I noted earlier, while there was evidence of other burns on this arm prior to this exercise, there was no such mark on the spot in question. Now, however, there appears to be a newly irritated area on the patient's forearm of approximately 2 to 3 centimeters in diameter. It bears all of the hallmarks of a superficial burn. I expect that there will be blistering in a few hours. The audience gasped in astonishment. Those in the 3 front rows reserved for special guests, journalists, and members of the medical community were scribbling furiously on their clipboards and notebook pages, while those behind them in the general seating area whispered in muted wonder, shaking their heads. I fully understood their skepticism. Not even 2 years earlier, I, too, would have been dubious if I'd seen what they had just had. The truth was that before becoming hysterical myself, all I'd known about the malady was what I'd read about in the newspapers or heard from my father, who, like all doctors in the city, had confronted a dramatic rise in hysteria cases in recent years. Even so, it had seemed a world away from my own life, as did the women he diagnosed. Like Charcot, my father had seen hysteria in at least part as a reflection of the dizzying pace at which modern society operated, the result of our inability to keep up with the hurtling speed with which we now traveled from one place to the next, and the even more hurtling speed with which information, image, and sound passed through telegraph wires, gramophone speakers, and light itself. Papa's prescription to his wealthy hysterics was in stark contrast to Charcot's mandated regime for his far poorer ones. It was a rest cure involving no physical or mental exertion, and lots of bland and milk-based food. Many of his patients took it within their country estates. All of this I knew, of course, but before entering the Salpêtrière, I had no idea of the astonishing range of conditions associated with hysteria, conditions that, to me at least, often bordered on the fantastical. I'd seen bellies swell during hysterical pregnancies and breasts that expressed hysterical milk. I'd seen girls become so rigid that they could be laid across the backs of two chairs like logs, and hysterics pushing darning needles through numbed palms without flinching. Other hysterics suffered hysterical yawns that lasted for days, leaving them wandering around with their mouths stretched wide like tortured figures in a Munch painting. I'd seen the palms of hysterical hands and the soles of hysterical feet weep real tears of blood, which, when wiped away, revealed no signs of any wounds. I'd even tended a patient who had inexplicably forgotten French and could only communicate haltingly in German. I still have no explanation for these events, any more than I can explain why some hysterics lost their contractions when they seized, while others suffered contractions solely during their fits, or for that matter, why I was one of the very few of all these women who had actually and fully recovered. What I do know, and what I will go to my grave averring, is that with very few exceptions, the symptoms I witnessed were real. They were not, as Charcot's rivals and critics were even then beginning to charge, the result of trickery on our parts or subconscious coercion on his. They may have been unpredictable in duration and presentation. It wasn't uncommon for a hysteric to go to sleep with one symptom and awake with another, a contracted arm replaced by a numbed tongue, blindness inexplicably morphing into dumbness. But the illness underlying them all was the same. Some strange alchemical interaction between our tortured psyches and our abused bodies, between the intolerable experiences we struggled to ban from our thoughts and the frail, fragile physiques that fell victim to that struggle. Above all else, though, it was real, just as the events I lay out for you in these pages are real. They were improbable, incredible even, but they happened.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I know this book is about to come out, so I imagine what's next is a book launch and a book tour. Is that right?
Not so much. Definitely a launch. A lot of writing and podcasting. Not so much a tour. I think, at least in the States now, that isn't happening as much with many books because it doesn't seem to move copy. And I think especially after COVID, bookstores are sort of a little more reluctant to use their space in that way. I will be visiting a few places, though, and I am doing a number of podcasts like this one. And I'm working on an article right now for Lit Hub and a few other pieces of writing. So those will be popping up as well. And then, who knows what will happen as things gather steam and then the paperback comes out. We'll see.
Do you have another book in the works?
I am at the very, very beginning stages of the next project. And I can't say much about it, but I can say it's going to also be historical, but not as deeply set in the far past. I think it's going to be probably more of a interwoven narrative set dually between 1960s and kind of the 1990s, early 2000s. And it's going to focus on adoption. It's a topic that I'm quite interested in. I'm actually adopted myself. And so I think in some ways I'll be exploring some of those themes and ideas, and also looking at issues, again, of female bodily autonomy, because it's set partly in pre-Roe versus Wade. And I think it's important to kind of look at what the world was really like in those days, and will become again, unfortunately, once women sort of lose the right to determine what they want to do with their bodies for themselves.
Very interesting. Well, I will definitely look out for that.
Great. And
if everyone else wants to keep up to date with what's going on in your world, where can they find you?
I have a website that I am currently relaunching. So there will be events and podcasts and things like that listed there. And also lots of I'm putting up some of the pictures that got me started on this whole crazy journey and some of the interesting facts that I really loved and also had a hard time, learning about. So that will all be up there once we launch.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll include a link to your website so people can find you really easily.
That'll be great.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. This was wonderful. Thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you. I loved talking with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you again to Jennifer Cody Epstein for such a riveting conversation. You can find Jennifer on Twitter at Jen Cody Epstein, on Instagram at Jen Epstein, and on her website, jennifercodyepstein.com. Please join me next week when I'll be speaking with award-winning debut author Kate Green about her novel, The Curious Kidnapping of Nora W. Check back next week to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book. Thank you for listening to Storytime in Paris. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and you can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to rate and review it wherever you listen to podcasts. This is the fastest and easiest way to help the podcast grow, which will help me attract more great authors to bring to you. Please also spread the word to all the people you know who also love to read. If you'd like to go even deeper, join our book club over on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio, where I invite authors who have been on the podcast to come speak with us about their books and delve even deeper into the secrets we couldn't spoil on the podcast. Thank you again, and happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.